Good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today we'll be covering the Austroads Polymer Modified Binder, or PMB, spray seal trials, and our presenter today is Steve Patrick of ARB Group. Warm welcome to all of our audience here today. Of course we cannot run webinars without the ongoing support of our wonderful attendees, so thank you for that ongoing support, and we hope you enjoy today's webinar. Just a few housekeeping matters before we get the show started. My name is Angela Juhas and I'm the Webinar Program Coordinator here at ARB Group. If ever you have any webinar or training related inquiries, I would be your best point of contact. Our webinar today will be approximately 40 minutes in duration and 20 minutes allowed for questions. Now please do not wait until the end to ask your questions, ladies and gentlemen, because the more interactive we can make the webinar, the more enjoyable it will be for everyone. We are recording today's webinar as per usual, and everyone interested will have an opportunity to review the footage again and also review the presentation material, which will be sent to you via email. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, we welcome your questions and your interaction. So if you do have any for Steve, please do type them into your questions box and they'll come through at our end, and we'll answer them at the allocated question times. Now if we don't get to your question today, ladies and gentlemen, we do have a rather big audience with us. Please don't hesitate to contact us after the webinar. Now before we get started with our presentation, I'd like to formally introduce Steve Patrick and welcome him to the studio with me. Thanks for your time, Steve.
Thank you, Angela.
And could you tell me a little bit more about yourself and perhaps your role with respect to the PMB trials?
Well, I've been at ARB Group for a bit over 9 years now. I'm working as an engineer. I've had a couple of roles. For the last 4 years, I've been working in our servicing division, and we are charged with various responsibilities, and all typically to do with road servicings. And this PMB trial has been one of the key projects that I've been working on in the last couple of years.
Well, that's fantastic. And look, some of you might remember Steve, as he has delivered on PMB trials previously, and as I understand it, we're at a new stage with the trials now. So we're very eager to learn more, and I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Yep, thanks, Angela. Well, as you can see on the screen now, the contents of today's presentation, I'm pretty much just going to take you over the whole project that we conducted, giving you a bit of an overview of these field trials which we have conducted. So after introducing the work and giving you a bit of background on what it's about, I'll talk to you about the site selection and assessment process, the construction of the trial and how the trial was laid out, our sampling and testing activities with the materials that we used in the trial, some observations that we have made to date, and unsurprisingly I'll finish with some conclusions. Now, around half the bituminous binder usage in Australia is used in spray seals, and within this, the proportion of PMBs that is used in sealing applications is ever increasing. Periodic maintenance funding is becoming more difficult to obtain, and so the more alternatives you have available to you, the better. PMB seals can be used to address cracking and other pavement distress, which are more likely to occur when intervals of reseal application are increased due to funding restraints, which is a familiar problem, I'm sure, to many of the practitioners listening to this webinar today. PMBs can also be used in lieu of pavement rehabilitations and reconstructions. Austroads has been looking at PMB since 1994 and has witnessed significant development of raw materials and manufacturing techniques that are used. The latest Austroads PMB specification is called T190 and it has revised PMB classifications and includes the introduction of a new grade that had not previously been produced and field validated. I guess firstly, what is a PMB? A PMB consists of bitumen, polymer and other blending additives and digesting oils. You can see it on the screen there. Basically it's a bituminous binder with bits of plastic in there. So the black bit is the bitumen and the white stuff on your screen is the polymers. obviously well, maybe not obviously, but they're typically blended up a bit better than you see in that photo when you get to using them in the road, but photo for indicative purposes only at this stage. Now, the history of T190. It is based on a set of test procedures that have been used in Australia for several years. The intention of the specification is to achieve performance in the field for both spray seal surfacing and asphalt pavement applications that utilise polymer modified binders. The specification limits in the document are currently framed around the results of nationally coordinated field trials and laboratory studies that are supplemented by the Austroads member authority experience. The first PMB specification was released 20 years ago and has been developed and improved ever since, with a record of the key documents displayed on your screen now. Actually, there's been some very minor changes made to T190 that was issued this year, and I should have included that on this slide, but I'm sure a couple of you picked that up.
Oh, that's all right. I'm sure, Steve, you'd be more than happy to engage in a bit of conversation if anyone does want to contact Steve about that after the webinar.
Yes, please do. Over the years, there have been many changes to what is involved in the PMB specifications. Changes in the PMB grades and the requirements. The multi-grade binders have gone in, and I think now out, and improved point of delivery quality indicators for PMBs. If you wish to look up this document, there's a front page or the commentary page of the specification that gives you a bit more information on the development of this work. Now, the specification has the following grades, or the grades that you can see on your screen now, that can be used for sprayed sealing. You can see they all have a designation, beginning with an S for sprayed sealing, followed by a number, and then a polymer designation. Please note that that numerical designation is an arbitrary number only and should not be interpreted as implying a hierarchy of polymer content or performance. On the screen I have listed what you might expect a concentration of polymer in those particular grades, but the number designation, there is no strict tie back to any content. The proportions of, that's what I was saying. S45R is a factory-produced crumb rubber product. It may not be available all over the country, so you should check with your local suppliers. However, for these trials, we have a site out in Coober Pedy, and we successfully hauled a truck full out to Coober Pedy from Sydney, and so that's a fair distance to take. So wherever you are, check with your local suppliers anyway. So the objectives of these trials, why were we doing them in the first place? The objective was to validate and rank the performance of PMB sprayed seal binders for the different uses and applications. Field validation of the performance of these current generation PMBs will help assist appropriate binder selection and hopefully enabling longer seal life and reduced maintenance costs for practitioners. We were investigating the performance of PMBs at two levels. As a crack inhibitor, so determined by crack growth measurement, how good are these PMBs at stopping cracks coming through, and by the quality of the seal, determined by sand patch texture depth and visual assessment of the surface quality.
Now, where was that photo taken, Steve? Is that
That's taken at the Coober Pedy trial site, which I'm about to introduce. So you can see, all the red dirt up in the top of the frame, as you find out in the middle of nowhere in Australia, and you can see the heavily cracked surface at the bottom there with a bit of pumping coming through as well. So that's the Stewart Highway we're at, which is what we get to now: site selection and assessment. There was an Australia-wide search for appropriate locations to stage the PMB sprayed seal trials. All the state road jurisdictions were provided with selection criteria, and were asked to identify potential trial sites within their road network. From these, 2 trial sites were to be selected. The sites were inspected for suitability based on a number of criteria that influence seal behaviour, with the horizontal curvature, how straight your road is one way to look at it. We were looking for ideally straight and uniform road sections. The significance of cracking, we were looking, well, as I just explained, we were looking at the ability of PMBs to withstand cracks, so that the existing cracking on the site was an important factor that we were looking for. Climatic conditions, we were looking for, ultimately we wanted one in a hot and a dry type situation, and we also wanted one in a colder, wet location. Just testing the PMBs over a greater range of variables. We were looking for different concentrations of traffic, i.e. one heavy and one light. And we also looked at practical applications, like were there material stockpile and sites available, were we able to get construction vehicles and observers and people doing other work around the site. So the potential sites identified by the jurisdictions were subsequently inspected by an expert group made up of members of the Austroads Bituminous Surfacings Working Group, and they were charged with the responsibility of selecting the 2 best sites appropriate for these trials. In the end, we ended up with one in Coober Pedy, as you saw in the photo just before. Now, if you don't know, Coober Pedy is practically in the middle of South Australia and almost in the middle of the whole country. The trial site is about 4 kilometres long and is on a 2-lane, 2-way section of the Stewart Highway, approximately 4 kilometres out of Coober Pedy. This site was chosen for its heavily cracked surface, in most parts crocodile-style cracking, which it appears as an area of small segments bounded by cracks, with the appearance of a crocodile skin, most likely caused by fatigue stress of the surface. The site is subject to generally hot, dry climatic conditions and low traffic levels, but with a high proportion of heavy vehicles. As you can see here, I've just got some weather data for the Coober Pedy site. The rainfall on the left with relatively low levels of rainfall, and then the temperature distribution throughout the year on the right. And as you can see, in the summer months, the average temperatures of above 35 degrees Celsius. It is pretty warm out there. Now the Cooma trial site, Cooma is south of Canberra. Our trial site is on the Monero Highway there. It's actually, the site is about halfway between Cooma and Canberra, but we call it the Cooma site. It's about a 2.8 kilometre long section. It's 50 kilometres north of Cooma, 65 kilometres south of Canberra. This was chosen for a cooler weather climatic condition and its higher traffic count. The Coober Pedy site was very low traffic but lots of heavy vehicles, whereas this site was a much greater proportion of traffic. It's a far more urban area, and especially in the winter months it gets a lot of traffic down to the New South Wales snowfields, which Cooma is pretty much the gate to those. There was also a large amount of cracking at this site, typically in more larger blocks, reflecting joins from underlying stabilisation. So you can see here the rainfall on the left. I've got Cooma and Canberra data in there, just for your interest, but it's a far more significant amount of rainfall in this part of the country and on this site. And on the left there you can see far lower average temperatures, much lower in summer, and then in the winter it getting down to, about 12 degrees in the middle of the year.
Just a slight climatic difference there.
Yeah, a little bit. We went and did some inspections for these trials last week, and on the first, this was in February, and the first day we went to Cooma and it was 15 degrees, and then the next day we went to Coober Pedy and it was 40 degrees. So.
Well, that actually sounds a bit like Melbourne. So.
Yeah. Okay, so once we selected the sites, we did a bit more assessment of what was really there. And so we were able to judge the ongoing performance of the trial seals. We really needed to collect a lot of information about the existing condition of the road surface. So before we can make judgments about the performance of the new seals, we need to understand what is happening to the road and how this may influence the ongoing performance of the seal. As such, surveys of the test sites were conducted prior to the trials, gathering important information that may influence our findings. We used an ARB network survey vehicle, which recorded road geometry and location data, surface condition properties, and road crack data with digital imaging equipment and laser profilometry. This data was used to finalise detailed planning for the test section locations, and we were able to do this from the office, and also provide the basis for comparison for the performance of the trial surfaces throughout their lives. Additionally to that assessment, a visual assessment of the site condition was conducted at both trial sites by experienced practitioners. Walter Holtrop, who is now formerly a VAPA, and Barry Mulholland, who works for Sprayline, is a spray company that operates out of Victoria. So they did these inspections immediately before the new surface was laid, just further assisting with the identification and understanding of any anomalies that may arise during the trial. Then data collected in these inspections included judgments of many of the important indicators of spray seal quality from a more close-up point of view, like the things listed on your screen now. The layout of the aggregate, was there any aggregate loss, binder condition and level up the stone, and cracking, those sort of things. Looks like we have some question time, Angela.
We do have question time, and we've got a bit of a shy audience, but I just want to clarify something. I have had a few queries to those who may have joined us late. We are recording today's session, and all of the presentation material will be made available to all of yourselves, so please keep an eye on your email. Questions come through from Ashley. Thank you, Ashley, for your question. What was the age of the existing seals, Steve?
I would have to check my records for the exact age, but they were both quite old. Especially the Coober Pedy site was a very old seal, quite a hard seal. It was heavily oxidised. As part of the testing, we were driving survey nails into the surface so we could relocate those spots further, and it was an extremely difficult task beating the nails in because the surface was that hard. So I think that was about a 15-year seal, and I think the Cooma seal was more like about 10 years old, but both of a reasonable age.
Fair enough. Okay, dokie. Why don't we go on with the presentation then, and we'll take some more questions later on.
Okay, so stepping into the construction phase of the trials. Immediately before we started construction, we collected several detailed aspects of the road condition, both checking and assisting with the seal design and further providing basis for the future monitoring of the trial surface. Sand patch texture depth measurements were taken to ascertain the surface texture depth in the trial section, and these are fed directly into the Australian seal design method. We used a ball penetration test to test the hardness of the surface. This is typically used on for potential embedment on sealing aggregate into a granular pavement. However, as it's a trial, we basically figured collecting more information is a good approach, and if we collect this information, we can use it in the future. We may as well, so that's the approach we were taking with that. And you can see in both photos, actually, that's me with a 1 metre square sheet of plastic taking a detailed crack map of the surface. So basically I had pieces of plastic which are laid on a representative section of the road which we selected, and then I traced every single crack from that square metre onto the plastic. The idea being that once the new seal is laid over, we can monitor, we can keep coming back to this spot. This is where we drilled those nails into the surface, so we can keep finding this spot and use the plastic to track how the cracks are coming back through the surface, if at all, and then this will give us an objective measure of the crack regrowth. So as you can imagine, that was quite a fun task, and so here's an example of two of the crack maps which I drew, and you can imagine they're 1 metre square, so they're quite large. They look like interpretive wallpaper or something for a nice modern house. Anyway, moving on.
Or maybe you could sell it.
Yeah,
to some
I was
designers.
just hinting. You send me an email afterwards, everyone, if you're into some modern art. Anyway, trial construction binders. So I guess this is getting into the real purpose of the trial. The bitumen and PMB binders listed on the screen are defined in the Australian Standard AS 2008 for the bitumens and the T190 PMB specification, which I was talking about earlier. So there's the C170, which is the control bitumen. So it's just a standard non-modified or unmodified bitumen product, which we're using as a control, basically what would happen if there weren't PMBs and the binders used there. And then the S10E, S20E, and I won't read them all out because I'm sure you can all read. All of those were used. Also, we opened up the trial to manufacturers to include proprietary products of theirs that don't necessarily fit into the Austroads P&B specification, but these are products they offer for sale anyway. And so we laid these alongside our trial and monitored them with our trial, basically just making the most of the situation and the time that we're spending out there. The resealing contractors chose the source for the products for each trial through their normal procurement processes, and they were also responsible for the seal designs used in the trials. This is so the trial reflected a real-life situation as much as possible, and we weren't just creating an idealised or special set of circumstances for the purposes of the trial. Basically just trying to reflect real life as best as we could. A trial layout. The binders were laid adjacent to each other along the trial roads, so all the different sections should be subject to the same traffic and stress conditions, allowing a true comparison of their performance with minimal variability introduced by other factors. At Coober Pedy, each binder was laid in 250 metre full width sections at 2 different application rates, so 500 metres in total for each product being tested. In Cooma, we had a bit less space to play with, and each section was only 300 metres long, with 1 lane in each section being utilised for our assessment purposes, as the cracking behaviour was worse in this lane and more suited to our trials. So we have a poll question.
All right. I might take this
Angela's
one.
going to take over.
All right, thank you, Steve. Now, for those of you who are new to our webinars and how polls work, I'm going to launch that, and you'll see a blue pop-up box on your screen, and if you could just select your answer choice. The question is, of course, do you take samples from your road building activities? So the answer choices there are yes or no, and I'll leave that open for a few more moments while we get those responses through. Steve, do you anticipate?
Oh, there's no real. Well, there might be a right or wrong answer, but this is sort of almost more for my interest in introducing the next topic of my chat. But I won't try and sway the answers, but I'm very interested to see what. I think we have quite a lot of people that are responsible for road building here, so I'll be interested to see what the response is.
Absolutely. All righty. Well, I might close the poll there. Thank you to all of you who got your answers through, and I'll share those results. So, Steve, 68% of people answered yes to that question. So, what does that mean to you?
Oh, no, that's good. I mean, I'm about to talk about why sampling is good, but well, especially for purposes of our trials, we'd be completely lost without sampling, and so it's one of the things. Well, let's go to the next poll question.
Absolutely. So we've got a follow-up poll question, ladies and gentlemen. If you could cast your vote once again. When do you take samples of materials? And we've got 5 answer choices there. So from the factory, upon arrival at work site, after they've been applied, or other, or perhaps all of the above. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll just leave that one open for another moment. And as those responses coming through, Steve, any thoughts on what people might be responding here as a typical?
Well, again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to this question, but it's going to be fit to your purpose. So yeah, I'm just very interested to see what we get. Yeah.
Of course. Alrighty. Well, thank you to those of you who have answered, and I'll just close and share those results. And Steve, it looks like the majority, so 54% of people have answered D, all of the above.
Yeah, well,
Is that surprising?
No, that's not surprising, really. I guess where I was going with this is, well, for this trial, we collected an unusually large volume of samples. It's basically so if any future tests are developed, for example, a sprayed seal binder cracking test, we can use these samples to validate any laboratory tests against the accumulated and demonstrated field performance. It's, I guess, with sampling, if you take the sample, you can always test it later. If you don't take a sample, you can't test it later. So we very much took the approach with this that we're going to take everything, and if we can use it, we will use it later and see what we can find with it. And I think that's generally a good approach for road construction. So we did subject the binders that we collected to the large list of tests, basically testing against the specifications for the bitumens and PMBs. So we took samples, and we took samples of the binders. Leading back to our last question, we got samples as the binders left the factory, and we also got samples as just before they were fed into the sprayers. So we were able to track if there was any degradation or deterioration in the products during the transport, and yeah, we tested at both ends. So yeah. Also, we had a person for both trials. We had a laboratory technician on site all day that was dedicated simply to sample collection and identification, and they were on site from pre-dawn to the last spray run of the day. So the sampling and testing was a very key and important part of this work. In order to maximise the potential knowledge gained from the trials, we also collected some additional data. Samples of the end paper, which is used like masking tape when painting to create defined edges, were collected to investigate the effective SBS morphology, which is the varying combination of bitumen and polymer phases in a PMB. There is currently no commonly available lab test method to simulate seal performance, and the current focus of research is to investigate the possible effects of PMB morphology and stability on seal field performance. So these samples will be investigated in an attempt to determine a relationship between lab test results and field performance. An infrared camera was used in an attempt to gather indications of binder spraying details such as transverse binder distribution, block nozzles, and spraying temperatures by photographing the start of the spray runs. And also during the Cooma trials, the transverse distribution of the seal applications were measured by RMS technicians. You can see this in the bottom left hand of your screen at the moment. They were using the field mat technique, which is used in the calibration of bitumen sprayers. A carpet strip is placed across the section being sprayed as a continuation of the end paper, and then a cut up and weighed to measure the amount and variation of bitumen laid across the width of the road. Okay, so now we've talked about planning and assessment and construction. We step into the monitoring and outcome phase of the trial. So we are currently in the monitoring stage, and it is also a very important stage. This enables the verification and validation of design procedures and construction techniques. Previous experience with Austroads seal trials has shown that it requires about 2 years trafficking for the road to settle, and before you can make any sort of preliminary conclusions about the sprayed seal trial. Basically, the road is settling. Long-term monitoring can be, well, it's very advantageous to continue long-term monitoring after this to confirm or amend any primary conclusions. We have recently undertaken the 2-year inspections, and we are hoping to secure funding to keep assessing them over the following years, probably at a two-year gaps in between inspections. Long-term monitoring is quite similar to the initial site monitoring discussed earlier. It consists of photographic records of surface defects and overall condition, visual inspection to rate seal characteristics, ball penetration when appropriate and texture depth, and sampling of the binder to enable measurement of the viscosity of the binder as it ages, and also that crack mapping which I was showing you earlier. Now, texture data. If we have anyone from New Zealand with us in the audience today, I'm sure they'll be quite aware that texture data is one of the key triggers for reseal activities in New Zealand, and so this might be a bit of interest for them. This is showing the texture of the Coober Pedy trial site measured before the trial, i.e. with the old road surface, immediately after construction, and after a 12-month period. So you can see a dramatic rise in the texture once the trial seal is laid. So you go from the dotted line down the bottom there as the pre-trial seal, and then the thick black line is immediately post-construction. As the old surface remains before and after the trial sections, the texture can be seen to drop back to its original poor texture at the extremities of the section. After 12 months, the seal has settled slightly and the texture is reduced between 2 and 3 millimetres along the length. The sections before and after the trial has also been resealed in the meantime and have a texture consistent with the trial seal. We just had a question, MPD, so that is a mean profile depth. It's a measure of texture depth that is used with laser profilometry. So this data was collected by the South Australian Road Authority, actually, with their two-laser, I think it's a two-laser laser profilometer.
Thanks for raising that, Thomas. Much appreciated.
And actually, because you just asked that question, you'll notice in this one we are talking in texture SMTD. Oh, geez, the pressure of the moment, I cannot think of the name of that one, but this was measured with the ARB survey vehicle. We did this with a slightly different vehicle that was used to measure the data in South Australia, but it's broadly the same concept, slightly different way of calculating the result. In this case, we only have data for pre-trial and after 10 months. However, again, you can see a dramatic improvement in the texture depth after the seal has been constructed. There are a couple of points along the length of the road where the texture matches. These are points where there are bridge decks that we didn't reseal as part of the trial, so the texture depth remains the same on them, that's why they are measured the same. Also, there's some, I'm about to get to that point, but there's a bit of distress in the form of stripping in the trial in this section at the end of the trial, and so in those areas where the stone has been stripped away and the texture is not as good, and that has come up in the survey vehicle survey as well. Now, stepping into the binder testing results. So this is back in the laboratory, we collected all those samples and put them through this suite of testing. We found that 6 of the 12 specified PMB binders showed, as manufactured or straight out of the factory, test results which met the requirements of either the bitumen standard or the PMB specification T190. All the as manufactured binders, except the crumb rubber binders, met the storage stability requirements of the European PMB specification, which is very similar to the storage stability in the Austroads requirement. However, it's a bit hardier, a bit more sensitive, so we use that test in the place of the Australian version. A number of the binders actually met asphalt grade PMB requirements. T190, as I mentioned earlier, has spray seal and asphalt grade PMB requirements, and there's a bit of overlap in them. They're called different things, but certain grades from spray seal are very close to certain grades in asphalt, and vice versa. And so we actually ended up with a couple of PMBs in this trial that met the asphalt grade. And so essentially what this will mean is that it'll give us an indication of how asphalt grade PMBs may perform in sprayed seal, so it's quite interesting in itself. Most of the binders studied did not show a marked difference between as manufactured and as delivered properties, so that's straight out of the factory and before they go into the truck before use. And also these changes in the test properties during transport did not occur for the bitumen samples and PMBs that contained lower amounts of polymer. So it was indicating that with more polymer in there, you might expect a greater difference between as manufactured and as delivered, but and far less effect for the lower level modification products. Now, what have we found after about 2 years on these sites? This is a photo of the Coober Pedy site, which is about a month ago we were out there. It was a lovely 40-degree day, perfect sunshine, not a cloud in the sky. And as you can see there, it's a pretty good seal. In general, the seals on this site are performing quite well. We found the aggregate spread rate has a big influence on the performance. The aggregate spread rate was quite variable in this job. We noted it was the first job on a contract for the crew making, or for the crew constructing these seals, and perhaps the truck drivers weren't practiced. We also found that there's the first couple of seals laid. Well, basically there was a dramatic improvement as the guys got used to their equipment. So the first couple of seals they laid weren't as good as the ones they laid a couple of later on. So that was quite an interesting observation. The seals are generally quite hungry and highly textured. The binder level at the stone is lower than is desired for this 2 years life stage, indicating that the binder application rates may be too low. Also, we found at this stage the C170 control product and the Shandy product, which was laid adjacent to the trials, are performing just as well as the PMBs. So the Shandy product was the leftovers of all the PMBs that were hauled out to Coober Pedy, mixed together and laid out in the road. So it's basically a non-specification PMB. And it's performing pretty well at this stage, but as is the unmodified product. This may change in the future, but after 2 years, everything's performing quite well.
Steve, sorry, a question from Ashley relevant to this. What size aggregate was used, and was it only a single coat?
Yep, the aggregate used in both circumstances, the Cooma and Coober Pedy sites, it was a single layer seal of 14mm aggregate. I think they had slightly different average least dimension, or ALD, figures. Yeah, 14mm single layer seal, basically.
Great. Thanks for your question, Ashley.
What else have we got in this? There was no difference in the asphalt binder and the spray seal performance either. So basically those binders that were adhering to that asphalt spec, there's no problem with those at this stage. Yes, and moving on. So Cooma, as you can immediately see, a bit of stripping down the middle of the centre line there, and also between wheel paths and the lane on the left. So obviously this site is not performing quite as well as I just was able to report for Coober Pedy. These trial seals are performing well in some instances, but several sections have been subject to high levels of stripping and may require maintenance intervention in the near future. Several sections have suffered from stone loss along the centre line and in between wheel paths. The lanes were sprayed separately, and overlap of the sprayers in the centre line we think may have contributed to this stripping. Recent research has shown that cutter levels in PMBs may need to be increased, and the observed cutter levels may have been too low on the second day of the construction of these trials when temperatures were a bit cooler. Stripping has occurred sort of across all the sections and not just those sections laid on the cooler day, so it's not the only reason, but we think it was a contributing factor. We used 3 emulsion products on the Cooma site, and the performance of these seals are quite good, amongst the best performing on this site. This may be a result of the enhanced wetting characteristics of the emulsions, basically the initial ability of the stone to stick to the bitumen. These seals are also generally hungry and highly textured. indicating design application rates may be too low. Additionally, there are a couple of sections with some significant grade, and these may have benefited from using different binder application rates in the uphill and downhill sections. And whilst there was no cracking evident in the new seals at the Coober Pedy site, there are some instances of cracks coming through from the stabilisation on this Cooma site. Now, conclusions. So, this webinar has discussed details of the trial planning, layout, construction and data on the condition of the trial section before and after the seals were constructed. Field validation of the performance of these current generation PMBs by means of these trials will ensure appropriate binder selection, enabling longer seal life and reduced maintenance costs. These nationally conducted trials aim to avoid costly duplication of efforts that would otherwise occur by conducting individual trials through industry or various straight road jurisdictions. Hoping it just assists introducing improved binders into periodic reseal programs around Australia. And finally, if you feel free to contact me after the webinar if you'd like more information, but there have also been reports published through the Austroads website on these trials. There's the two on the top of the page there, a construction report and then a 12-month summary report. They both have a lot of information in there that, if you're interested in this kind of thing. And also a new report will be issued this financial year under the project TT 1906, which is basically a project to inspect these spray seal trials and report on their progress. So that's it from me. Thank you, Angela.
Awesome. Well, Steve, we talked a little bit earlier about obviously the conclusions and the outcomes, and Vincent has raised a really good point. He says that all science is based on a simple principle of predict, observe and explain. What did you predict in terms of ranking of performance?
I guess there's, in some degrees, that's handled in the Austroads specifications. And thanks for your question, Vince, by the way. Somewhat handled in the Austroads documents that lay out the specifications of the products, and then also guide you to how they're going to be used. Like products with lower level of modification might be good for a gentle sort of reseal over and not much of a problem area. And then if you were looking to withstand lots of cracks, you might want to pump up the level of polymer modification to give you that little bit of extra strength. So I guess it's really where we're testing the guidelines that are already existing in the Austroads guides, and basically checking on them and making sure previous assessments were valid and whether we can improve on them or put any more information in them that might help.
Great. Well, I mean, Vincent can always contact you after for a more detailed chat if he likes. Thank you, Vincent. Question from Edwin. How was the existing surface treated prior to trial sealing?
Okay. The existing surfaces, there weren't any. I think you're referring to whether we went through and did any crack sealing or patching of highly distressed areas. There was nothing specific done immediately before the trials. Both sites had existing condition where there were patching and some other work done on the roads. Actually, and I think it's the construction report, there is detail on all the patching that is in the Coober Pedy site in particular. We located all those patches and highlighted where they were, because going back now, there are a couple of areas on those trials where there are areas coming up full, or basically meaning there's too much bitumen in specific areas on the road, and that quite often happens when you've got a bitumen-heavy patch under the road surface. So, but to answer your question directly, there was no immediate remedial works done to the sites other than the reseal just before we started the trials.
Awesome, great question. One from Chris. Chris is asking, could you please expand on the DH rates versus UH rates?
The downhill rates versus the uphill rates at the Cooma site that I was referring to. Basically, the stresses that are applied to downhill and uphill sections are different by vehicles, especially heavy vehicles travelling over the section. So, uphill you'll have say a truck with an engine driving wheels, providing a shear stress to the surface of acceleration, and when you're coming down a hill, you might have a braking or different forces. And so, if you go to the Austroads guides, it gives you a bit of an indication about whether you should be using less or more bitumen in those circumstances. However, for these trials, the same application rate was used on both sides, and I think that's something we could have improved on.
Thanks for your question, Chris. And Aaron's asking, with respect to the Coober Pedy site, were there any problems with bleeding out?
Not really. There are a couple of spots on the new seal where there's been some very localised bleeding. On one of the sections there's been a bit of a bleeding in one area, and that's been tracked along the section, so it sort of looks a bit worse than the actual problem is. But no, I think you're referring it's very hot climate out there, and so the bitumen is extremely lively still after 2 years. But that seal is performing very well. We're very happy with that one. It's not stripping and it's not bleeding. So yeah, we're quite happy with that at the moment.
Wonderful. And Jose is asking, I think we might have touched on this, but did the reseal use 14mm aggregate as well?
Both the reseals were 14mm aggregates. The existing surfaces of the sites, I'd have to look up the report myself to check exactly what the existing seals were, but both reseals were 14mm single layer.
Yeah, anyone interested can get in touch. Obviously, we don't want to give you false or misleading information now. And look, one final question we've got time for today, and it's just with respect to the change in technology over the years that helps with trial and testing. Thanks for your question, Jeff. How's the technology changed over the years?
Well, I guess spray sealing technology is broadly the same as it has been for quite a while. In terms of the guys constructing the seals, technology is always updating, but in terms of us monitoring the seals, like I think I showed the photo before where we took a thermal camera along to both seals, to both trials, and so we were seeing what sort of application that might have and whether that was any good at identifying the transverse distribution with the bitumen coming out of the back of the truck, or was there a blocked, are there blocked nozzles or such, and also I guess assessing whether the camera was going to give us any more valid information than any old techniques like laying the carpet across the road, which we did, and simple techniques like someone simply yelling out, "Hey, I can see a blocked nozzle." So yeah, it was. Yes, technology as in everything is always changing, but there's nothing too exciting that I haven't mentioned.
No, fair enough. That's all right. Thanks for your question, Jeff. That's all we have time for today, but once again I'd like to thank our wonderful audience for joining us today and supporting us during our webinar program. We hope you can join us again in future. And I'll take a moment to thank Steve as well for his time. I know he's a very, very busy man working on many projects at the moment, so it's a real privilege to have him here today. As I said, I hope you can all join us next time. If you keep an eye on your emails, you will receive some correspondence from me with respect to the presentation material. And I hope you all have a great afternoon. See you next time.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected. Goodbye.